trip. Which one?
Holland culture.
That's right. And you know that. I wish, in some ways, almost that the riverboat cruise that you guys have planned, great rivers up there.
Have you?
I wanted.
That's so good. We haven't decided what we're doing. Like, at the office, you know, and my two would be either that one.
10 days that you can get back home.
I don't know.
See,
That's my grandson.
It kind of like stays out, yeah. And I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, that was absolutely wonderful. And we had. That was wonderful.
But I wanted to go to.
Talking about sitting on the side.
And I don't wanna go that spring.
Oh,
We can
start.
because
It's 103. Are you like, yeah, they're working on our.
I almost that Mike's gonna join late anyway, so I wouldn't, don't wait for them.
Yeah.
to say.
Is it
They're
nice?
fixing our copier, so we couldn't print off the sheets.
Right. Okay, well, it's, we're recording, yeah. Expect this, because this one I thought was had a big number in it, so,
It did,
yeah,
it did.
so they're recording
It's
them,
the
but,
weather.
oh, for sure.
The weather.
You know, it's fine, I'll just make sure to speak to them.
late.
And this one.
All the weather, people are gonna just say,
Well, we sent out an email, right, saying that we're gonna record it if you don't want to come, so.
It's always funny talking to a, you're gonna have to interact a lot. Yeah, well, this on just for the recording point of view,
Thank you.
so,
All right, you ready?
sure.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our overview of Italy. Our trip, OLLI trip to Italy will be the bottom part of Italy, the sole of the boot. We are going to be there in 2025, October 4th, I believe, through the 14th. And Patrick is going to give us an overview today of all of Italy, the whole country. So.
Ok. Ciao, buongiorno. Parliamo italiano qui. Sì? Va bene. Non parlo italiano. Sì, problem. It's Italian, of course, is directly related historically to Latin. You heard there was an empire for a little while. So I just wanted to give a kind of a macro sense. So like I say, the tour that you're talking about doing really is the southern part of it. It's a food tour. And I remember when I was chatting with them, I mean, that, you know, that if you're into that, it's great, but I'm not going to spend an hour and a half talking about 3 towns down there. So I thought I'd give you the whole, like, welcome to Italy. Interestingly enough, it's a fascinating country. I wonder if we actually turn that light off overhead. I think it actually looked a bit better last time we. Oh, really? If you're seeing it okay? There is, yeah. It's I love the view outside, but it really is a lot of good. That's okay. As long as you can. Yeah, tutto bene. So Italy is, there's a lot to talk about in Italy. So why don't we start with a macro sense? Now, this morning we were talking about Iceland with 374,000 people. Italy has 60 million people. And it's, I think, the 7th largest city in Europe, meaning that it's actually quite densely populated. Its biggest city is Rome, although Milan is also a very significant city. Italy, though, comprises probably more than you actually think here, because of course, famously, there's the boot, and you have the whole thing coming down. The northern border is pretty logical, because basically those are mountains the whole way around, right? So it's quite a logical, looks like a tree from the top, but it also includes, of course, famous Sicily. There are islands, Italian islands further down the coast, and then this island right here is Italian. It's called Sardinia. Sardinia, you might, well, you probably heard of it anyway. What's the island just north of Sardinia? It is Corsica. And who was probably the most famous person born in Corsica? Napoleon Bonaparte. He was Corsican. And the Corsicans and the Sardinians actually have their own dialects. So you'll see signs like on bumpers of cars, si sei Cors, parla Corsico. If you think if you're Corsican, speak Corsican. Sardinian's another dialect. But why Sardinia particularly interests me is Sardinia is considered one of those blue zones. I think there's 5 of them in the world where people live over 100. And they've done so much research on this, and it actually affects the way I take in nutrients. Because of course, Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia, there's one actually, California, which has a lot to do with money, but these zones where they live, but here, of course, is really where they do all the study about that famous Mediterranean diet. Now, obviously, it's all the Mediterranean, needless to say. But the one thing that I found with the blue zones, now we know these things. I mean, one of the wonderful things about OLLI, for example, is socializing, super important, to stay purposeful. But in terms of diet, whether they're vegetarian or fish or meat or olives, they average 5 servings of leafy greens a day. So when I'm home, because I get really bored eating salad, I actually juice 5 servings of greens every morning. Let's put in a little bit of butter, sometimes a little chia or yogurt or something, warm water. I blend it up and drink it. Like people say, what does it taste? It tastes like grass, right? But it's just one consistency. That's always interested me. But the fact that Sardinia, and another thing that shows up both in Sardinia, their local dialect, and in Okinawa, is they don't really have a word for retired. So they don't have this sense of life sort of coming to an abrupt change or something. Really interesting cultural thing. So, it's that's an interesting thing to talk about. But macro Italy, you've probably heard historically, Italy has had pretty unstable politics. We'll get, of course, into the history of it, but it's sort of fun to talk about it now. It's very, very regional. I mean, so much so that much more so than Spain, which we talked about the other day, but like a far northern dialect and a far southern dialect are almost unintelligible to each other, right? So they really do have, and that happens in Germany as well, by the way, big differences in the language, but they are, extremely regional that way. And you can just about draw a line right about Rome and say that's the industrial north, and that is generally the rural and historically poor south. So if I were in New Jersey or New York or so many places right now, and we actually had, I realize a lot of people at home, so I'm waving to the camera because of the weather. But where we are in Michigan, different migration patterns. But in so much of the eastern United States, huge links to Italy historically. And most of that migration that went to places like New York and Boston, everything come from southern Italy, which is historically really poor and not industrialized. So that's a big divide in even the modern country today. But Italy does have a ceremonial president and then a prime minister. So it's a pretty typical parliamentary democracy. Although they go, it's pretty unique if a government lasts 2 years there. So they have so many different political parties. They have a system of proportional representation. I don't know how you absolutely do not have proportional representation in this country, but you do have a presidential system. Where I live in Canada is a parliamentary system, like the British parliamentary system, but it's not proportional, right? It is an interesting thing, but basically, and so you do see proportionality in Italy, Germany, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Belgium, like quite a few countries. But basically, roughly, and it's broken down into regions, but the political party will get the number of seats in government based on what percentage of the vote they got. And so you can easily have 8 or 9 or 10 political parties. So no one's actually big enough to take over governments. You have to create coalitions. And it is one of these great debates, whether that system is a better system or not. I must say, inherently, I like the idea of it because it'd be nice if our government represented how people voted, right? But Italy and Belgium are often held up as the countries where it's unsuccessful because the governments fail so much. I mean, Belgium once spent 18 months without a government. And I know we're not talking about Belgium here, but little Belgium with 10 million people has they have about 10 political parties, including a Flemish separatist party and a Walloon separatist party who won't play ball with anyone else, right? So, but then in the German case, it's been an excellent thing. It was a system that was imposed on Germany at the end of World War II so that you couldn't move into a kind of dictatorship, right? So that's where the political side is interesting. And so if we, rather than going forward from the ancient history, if we roll back, so the current Italian government is really very kind of on the right wing of European politics, absolutely, and quite anti-migrant and so forth. But we go right back to current Italy as we know it today, really dates from 1946. So Italy becomes, in what year? Just rough guess, what year did Italy become a country? Bit fun? In fact, if we take the United States, Germany, Italy, Belgium, and just pick another one randomly, Mexico. What's the oldest country out of those five?
Oh, it's not Germany.
That's the United States, 1776. So France, very clear line, French history. The kings of France are all buried down around here. Charlemagne, and Charlemagne's coming into our story, by the way, with Italy. Obviously, England and Scotland, clear identity there. Spain is sort of reunified 1492, but these countries were all broken down after the decline and collapse of the Roman Empire. They all become little kingdoms, and they unified about 1861. Right, the reorganization they called it, and so that's when modern Italy starts to come out, and then it really goes through an industrial boom in the northern half, and the southern half didn't, and that's when you got this massive emigration. So if you go to New York City and you go and see Little Italy, which I always try, if I'm in New York, I always go eat there, but it's getting choked out now by Chinatown. Like there just isn't massive migration from Italy anymore. It was a very specific period of time. The biggest recipient of the Italian migrants, immigrants, was actually Argentina. So that's why, even though the first language is Spanish in Argentina, they speak Spanish with an Italian accent. And the people who live around Buenos Aires are called porteños. And they almost all have links to southern Italy. And they went over there. Literally, Argentina doubled its population in the first 20 years of the 20th century. And it was the second richest country in the world after the US because of meat production. But it was distinctly Italian, so about half of them, and you see it in people's names and so forth. But the industrial north is interesting. Italy, despite a lot of economic challenges, quite regularly, does have a very high standard of living now. It has high income. I think the per capita is about $54,000-$55,000 a year, which again are funny statistics because you can always manipulate that. But it's the most diverse economy in Europe insofar as no one industry is particularly dominant. So it's actually quite a diverse modern economy. It's the 8th largest economy in the world. So it's, yeah, so Italy is important that way. More important than sometimes people think. It's a big powerhouse economy. It's a physically fascinating peninsula because you have all the Alps right up along Switzerland there, and then you have a spine of mountains right down the middle, and active volcano right now in Sicily, earthquakes the whole way up, like it's moving. It's the tectonic plates are really happening. So lots happens in Italy. And of course you go right back to the Empire days, which we're going to talk obviously a lot about, but they've been moving water in and out of those mountains there forever. I mean, you can go up to fountains in Rome today and fill your cup up with water that were aqueducts built by the Roman Empire. Pretty amazing. This sounds like an odd question, but it is a really relevant question. What do you think? You know how Christians have the symbol of the cross, and Christ was obviously killed on the cross. Why a cross? What does the cross represent?
Oh, what does it represent?
Not to a Christian today. Why do the Romans kill people on crosses? Fascinating thing to think about, isn't it? It's an awful thing. Because it wasn't just Christ. I mean, sometimes the roads into Rome would be lined with people, that were nailed up on crosses. You're being killed on your own sword. Get a sword and put it in the ground. That's what the cross is. So, it's an interesting thing to think about. And of course, when you talk about Italy and the transition from the Roman Empire to modern terms, of course, that's the rise of certainly the Western Christian Church, obviously the Catholic Church, but the Western Christian, the Great Schism with the East. So before we get back into some of the older history though, can you name 2 countries that are 100% inside Italy? The Vatican, right? The Vatican's an independent country, becomes independent under Mussolini, incidentally, right? So when they unify in 1861, a section of the papal states around Rome came in after. And that's where we get back to the Holy Roman Empire and so forth. So before they come in, and then they come in and create a royal family. But what's another country wholly within Italy? You're getting it. You got it? You did. San Marino.
San Marino.
San Marino calls itself the oldest republic in the world. And it's on the side of Mount Ticino. And it is, so you can see where Naples is, right? That's where you're gonna be going if you go on the trip. But there's San Marino coming up here. So let's get a picture. Yeah, so San Marino's entire economy are postage stamps and coins. They actually have high unemployment. They're only about 20,000 people, but it's a little town up on the side of the mountain. There you go. You can see the map. So just outside, you tend to stay in Rimini. Yep, over in the Adriatic. There it is. There's little San Marino. I mean, how neat is that, eh?
It's not just a town, it's a country.
It is a independent country, and it even has, in fact, one time I was in Turkey, and San Marino has a soccer team, and they have a team that goes to the Olympics and everything. And San Marino was playing Turkey. Turkey was playing in San Marino, and they drew. Like the Turks were so embarrassed. Like you should be able to, beat a country. So it's an old wall, and it's just so typical of these walled cities of the early days, because most, of course, these are all these little microstates, and I want to get into that history a bit more meaningfully. But yeah, San Marino says it's a republic since the 4th century, making it the longest republic. And remember, we defined this again the other day. A republic is a country without a monarchy. And perhaps the most famous of the medieval republics, of course, is the country straight north of Italy, which is Switzerland. Right? I mean, united around not having a royal family. So, but that's little San Marino up there. So it is totally independent. Although it functions as part of it. And now that they're in the European Union, and when the European Union was created and all the countries came together, these little places, if you joined me in Spain the other day, we talked about Andorra as well, tiny little country wedged between Spain and France. It's a little bit bigger than San Marino, but again, and can you name another couple of microstates in Europe? So the Vatican is the smallest country in the world, population. Liechtenstein, exactly. Liechtenstein, well, and I wanted to take you north anyway, and there's one more micro state in Europe. And Liechtenstein, I'll show it to you. So this is Switzerland we're coming up to now. There's Liechtenstein. Not an island by Switzerland, Germany. There is the Bodensee's up right up here. This is the Bodensee right there.
The Bodensee, that there's some little country.
No, it could be that there's an exclave, like from one of the other countries that's over across the border. See, Italy has an exclave right here. See this one, this is Lugano. Put Lugano on your list sometime. That's the one Italian-speaking canton in Switzerland, right? And why that's sort of, well, it's interesting for a lot of things. It's just so beautiful. So Switzerland, 63% of Swiss speak German. So Bern's the capital, Zurich, Schaffhausen, all that's German speaking there. Then down where Geneva is, famous Geneva, that's the French speaking part. And there's one canton here, Lugano, is Italian speaking, but there's one tiny town, Campione d'Italia, which is actually an Italian town. It's 100% inside Switzerland. And it's like less than a quarter of a mile outside of Italy, but you actually have to drive about 10 miles to get around because of the mountains. So that's all the Alps, right? So that's just kind of a cool thing. Liechtenstein, though, again, is one of these things. Liechtenstein really acts like it's Switzerland, like it uses the Swiss money and everything. But yeah, Liechtenstein is another microstate. It's the only, I guess, the Vatican too. But I always say it's the only country I've walked across in a day, but I think I've walked across the Vatican as well. Liechtenstein's entire economy is money laundering, by the way. Banks, you think banks in Switzerland. Yeah, a lot of big German money sitting there. But what's the one other micro? Just because it's fun to talk about. The other micro country is Monaco. Monte Carlo, yep. And that's in France. And they have a peculiar thing because they're independent, and their independence is guaranteed. On the proviso, they always have a male head of state or male heir to the throne. It's a principality. So there's Monaco there. And I do mention Monaco. You can buy an apartment in Monaco with no window and no bathroom for, I don't know, $3 million. But if you live there, you don't pay tax. So 3 million, maybe 4, but it's because people buy it so they have residency to avoid tax. So if you're someone who's sitting on billions, that's where we're really hoping collectively that the European Union cracks down on some of this stuff. But very interestingly, when the euro came in 2000, right? It used to be that it was the Italian lira. Now the Swiss still have their own currency because they're not in Europe, right? Neutral. But the French franc became the euro. Of course, all of these countries, with the exception of Switzerland, all use the euro now. But the Italians, because there was so much historic corruption down south where you hear about the mafia and all of that, they had to legitimize their money because their currency was disappearing. So it is said now that really the money of the mafia is in Nice. Nice right there, southern France, right across the border. There was a huge amount of Italian money right around 2000 that went over and bought real estate there. But imagine showing up to buy a nice apartment with a briefcase full of money, but it was getting the liras out and everything. That's where the EU was a really useful thing, like just cleaning out a lot of stuff. So do you know what people say about Nice? It's nice.
Yeah.
Our Nice trip. Now, come across the border and there's Genoa. It is said that Christopher Columbus was from Genoa. There are new theories coming out that use Portuguese. So that's still talked about. Yeah. He had some Jewish heritage, but again, a lot of that is being discussed that he may have actually been from the Azores and all sorts of other things. But there was Jewish population, and you might remember this. I mentioned it the other day. The word ghetto, as we think of it, is a neighborhood in Venice. Venice was the great trading city, and that was the neighborhood the Jews were allowed to live in. So true Jewish ghetto. So they allowed them to trade, but they still had to go back in at night. Still, nobody liked them that much. It was really hard to be Jewish.
Yeah.
It was so hard to be Jewish in Europe. It's almost like they needed their own country. It's yes, on my mom's side we have Jewish heritage, and I have this whole line of family that I never knew because they all burned up in ovens. So it's yeah, I mean it's a powerful thing. But and I'm actually flying in a few weeks to Venice, and so anytime I go back, I always go visit the old Jewish quarter there. But these are all these great trading cities. The one person we know for sure was from Genoa was Giovanni Cabatti, who you might know as John Cabot, and he was the first sort of British expo hired by the British, and he came over to this side of the world in probably 1497, although even that's debated, it could have been 1496, and he went into a rocky cove and he put up the British flag and he called it a newfound land. That's Newfoundland. So that's where you really see the start of English speaking migration into what becomes, of course, all of us here. So that's sort of interesting. So the Italians, when you're talking about that period of time, is because Italy had this boom right through the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries that we all call the Renaissance, starting out in places like Florence, and that's where we see the rise of Machiavellian politics and so forth. Okay. So it's fascinating, and a lot was studied. Bologna is probably the oldest university, certainly in the European side of the world. And I always qualify those things because you can argue, you go back to the times of Confucius in China, and they had schools that would be like universities. But it was interesting because the first degrees you would do way back in the 10th, 11th centuries, the first degrees you would do were actually history. So you're even looking back again, history, philosophy, pretty fascinating things. But let's just come back for the fun of it to kind of a macro sense. Italy is one of these countries that you could go on for a long, long time about, but because it is a peninsula, it is both very much at the heart of Europe, and it's also quite isolated in its own way. So if you think about the relationship along the eastern side, so there's the Adriatic. So back in the early days, of course, you have the rise of Greece. So we're going back now to 500 BC. And again, I know you know this history. I'm not going to try and give it to you in an hour, but you see actually a really good book. If you'd like to read a really interesting book, you may have read it, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And that really talks about why civilization, as we know it in the Western world, really grew up in the Fertile Crescent. Fertile Crescent is what is Iraq now. And it's because the way grain grew then, it grew in abundance, but then it didn't grow for part of the season, so you created food surplus. And when you did that, then you started to manage food surplus. Interesting read. Of course, like everything, there's some academics that disagree with some of the thesis, but humanity as we know it, because Rome, there's evidence of Paleolithic human life, like proto-human life in Italy, going back 850,000 years. So, this has been as we came out of Africa. the oldest evidence of humanity in what is now Europe is in Italy, right? Now, is it for sure Italy, or is that just what we found? But we know that people have been living here, and then we know Neanderthals were here 40,000 years ago. And when they do DNA testing in Europe, most people of European heritage do have some Neanderthal in them. So clearly, even though we were different, there was mixing. You know, and it'd be interesting to know to what extent people chose to do that or not. But you have the rise, of course, of Egypt. But if you want to go back a little further, and this is where we get linguistically, in my mind, I think really interesting. But down, so there's Egypt, of course. Here's the Fertile Crescent, the great rivers that come down there. The Euphrates is actually up there in Turkey. Like I've seen it in Turkey. I have technically been to Iraq. I crossed the border for about an hour once, dressed as a Kurd. But I was way down here. But really the rise of all of the languages that we know them in Europe occur as a migration up through this very interesting area through here, and these civilizations that form really thousands of years ago, even earlier than Egypt, and they're the Hittite languages. Kurdish is from that origin, but really all of the languages in Europe, with the exception of Finnish and Hungarian and some of those Uralic languages, are all Hittite in origin. And we say, and we know that because they conjugate verbs. So the way we conjugate verbs, which you don't do the same way in Chinese or something. So they're not. So that's the origin linguistically, and probably goes all the way back to Sanskrit and the Indus Valley, which is Pakistan, India now. It's probably where we trace the migrations. And I say we, I haven't done a lot of it, but I love reading about it. And they come up into Europe. There are a few fun kind of exceptions, like Albania is actually a different language altogether. But you see sort of the rise of Greece, and around the same time as Greece is starting to blossom and experimenting with some interesting things like democracy. We sometimes give them a little bit too much credit, right? It was only men and non-enslaved people and so forth, but still there was some attempt to vote. And we always juxtapose Athens with Sparta. Because Sparta was pure military, but the things like the Olympic Games, I mean, some of those really fascinating things that have carried on to the modern day. And this is what's so interesting, because from Greece to the Roman Empire, we could track stuff today that we talk about and do, right? We can talk about that directly. So the pre-Romans were the Etruscans. You probably know that name, I think. Sounds familiar, no? But they were the civilization and probably kingdom that was living around Rome, that, making a very, very, very long thesis, and to short that merges as the Roman Empire, the birth of Rome as a city. And the Romans were extremely organized. At the height of Rome, which we could say up around the time of Christ, the city of Rome was probably 1 million people. The world was probably 100 million. So, and then a lot of those lived over in places that, like what's now Beijing and Xi'an, where the terracotta warriors are. So in terms of Europe, I mean, Rome really was the center of everything. And did all roads lead to Rome? Absolutely. What's your trick to know if a road in Europe is a Roman road? That's the chariot. Right, so the width is we get there. It is dead straight. Roman roads are always straight because there wasn't a lot in a way of other buildings, and the Romans, they just drove it straight through. And the Romans were, of course, not at the height of the empire Christians. I mean, quite dramatically not. They were pagans, and they had their whole belief system, which you can tie back to Greece as well. I mean, all of those stories was very much pretty classically sun god and so forth. The Greek gods, I think one of the great switches that happened with Greece and then Rome versus Egypt is the Egyptians still had this deep relationship with the idea of afterlife. That's why the pyramids were built for the pharaohs to live forever and that sort of thing. Whereas the Greeks, and again the Romans, were not that big on afterlife. They still kind of believed in it, but their idea is it wasn't that nice a place. They were very, I mean, it's both. It was a powerful switch in thinking, but there was also a level of kind of hedonism. There's that famous line. I don't know where it came from, but I saw it once. And it was a Roman centurion, and an arrow hits him in his heart, and his dying words is, I should have gone to more parties. Because, and average life expectancy back in the time of the Roman Empire, as it's calculated, was about 29. So life was, but I mean, even in more recent times, remember Lord Byron, the famous writer, poet, he was down in Greece. I mean, he was English, obviously, but he was writing when he was in Greece. He wrote "In my waning years," and he was 33. Isn't it amazing to think about, eh? So the rise of the Roman Empire was incredible. And one can go, and wherever you go in Rome or in Italy, it's really worth always looking to come at some of this history. So, you get really Rome. What fun other quiz question. What year do most people kind of suggest that the Roman Empire finally collapsed?
Yeah, 500.
504 is when they called the troops out of Britain to come back and defend Rome. Probably more like 1492. Istanbul to Constantinople. Remember, the Roman Empire switches to the Byzantine Empire. All of Rome picks up and moves over here. And that line doesn't fall until the Turks arrive and conquer it. Right? So the fall, and so when you go to, and do put on another trip, Turkey should be high on your list. Safest can be friendly and fascinating. But right there in what is now Istanbul, but was Constantinople, you have the same chariot racing areas. You have all of that. It's all Roman. It would have been Latin speaking, same thing. So Rome descends into this collapsed kind of state area, the feudal system, which we're going to talk about in just a second here. But it keeps on going here, and you can watch it gradually as the Turks come in, diminishing, and then it comes to an end. And so the Hagia Sophia, the giant mosque that's there in Istanbul, was a church, and they converted it to a mosque, right? Put the symbols up, so it's pretty fascinating. So when Rome reaches at its apex, it's all just so the Roman Empire, obviously all of Italy, and Rome was, and life, if you were elite, life was pretty good. I remember a professor of mine at university years ago said, Rome collapsed because they taxed the middle class out of existence. And there's something to be said for that, because of course they had slavery. So you had a huge pool of people that didn't have any money, so they couldn't be taxed. And then the elite didn't pay anything, right? But the elite would go to war so they could have arches built for themselves. Both the Greek and Roman period, there was not, modesty was not a big deal in their lives. Right? Like the fellow who won the 100 meters, or the 100, whatever the sprint was, or the first marathon, that's right, then ran all the way home, saying I'm the champion of the world. It's some neat history that way. But Rome at its height goes right up into Scotland. It doesn't go to Hibernia. They knew Ireland's there, they didn't go. But St. Patrick would have spoken a vulgar Latin, because he would never have seen Italy, but he was the byproduct of the empire, right? So like a name like Patrick, like my name is a patrician, is a politician. And then you're all the way out of here, you're right across the north of Africa. I mean, up in Tunisia is Carthage, I mean, some of these famous cities you've heard of, I mean, it is vast. And their communication systems was good, but of course you didn't have email, you didn't have telephone. So it really was contingent on going from one important place to another and sharing that information, which is what keeps showing up in South America with the Incas as well, the vastness of it. So Rome obviously has probably the greatest collection of buildings from the Roman period, but the second biggest in all of Italy, which is interesting. Hey pal, welcome. I'm sorry, Mr. Talk. I had a meeting. Hi.
That's all right.
No, but it's nice to see you. Well, it's lovely to have you here. But so the other, among the many places, because all through what is now southern France, and say I was talking about Segovia in Spain the other day, there's aqueducts there. It's all over, but when there's Turin, you see up north, the Chao Turin, but I've got to get a little further up into here, way up. Then you find La Val d'Aosta. There it is. That town there probably has the second largest collection of Roman architecture. the whole empire. And it looks like a kind of random place. Incidentally, this is one of the bilingual regions of Italy. Both Italian and French are official languages up here, because there's France and there's French speaking Switzerland up there. But even though it looks like a random distant part of the country, one valley with huge mountains. So that's the exactly kind of thing where they moved all their forces up and down, right? And you were traveling by chariot, traveling by horse. But think for most of our history as a species, I mean, the overwhelming amount of human history is the furthest you get one day is how far a horse could walk, or how far a boat could float, right? I mean, the idea that I got here the other day, 3 hours to Chicago and an hour up to Detroit, right? I mean, that is so new in human history. But the way that the Romans were moving people up and down and building these incredible bridges, I mean, I'm sure life was not particularly enjoyable for the average person because it was a lot of just forced labor. But what is left over in Europe today are still the main population routes you see everywhere. I mean, it all goes back to those roads all leading to Rome, right? So up in northern England, do you know the famous wall they built? It's called Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian's Wall. Yeah, he was Emperor Hadrian, and they kept trying to take over Scotland, and the Scots wouldn't have it. So much so they said, forget it, we'll build a wall. Right? So they would do that kind of thing. Incidentally, the walls don't always work. They fall apart. just so you know, when there's a will, there's a way. So that's one section. Another section, which leads us into these migrations again, is so you get over to Big Milan. Milan is one of the famous cities when we talk about the diverse economy that is modern Italy. Milan is one of the great centers of haute couture. What do you call it? Clothing, like expensive clothing. Yeah. So, you know, Milan is where they often design it. Paris, they show it off. They sell it in Tokyo. But young people from around the world go to study design and stuff up in Milan. It's a big, powerful, wealthy industrial city. Little too industrial for my taste personally. I mean, that's where if you're going on this trip to southern Italy, a lot less industrial, which is I think kind of nice. I mean, industry is a great thing for jobs, but I don't particularly like to hang out necessarily in polluted towns. But if you get over, so we saw Genoa on the one side, and then famous Venice, which is spending more time underwater than above these days. All of Venice during the Middle Ages was this great trading nation. This peninsula right here, by the way, Pula, so let's see if a picture comes up, because there's a famous amphitheater in Pula here. Come on, switch. Pula is now Croatia, but that peninsula there is called Istria. And so that part of Croatia is actually bilingual Croatian Italian. Rovinja is beautiful, beautiful city. And this is as far to the west as you find Byzantium art or Byzantine art. Right, it's the artistic school that came out of that side of the empire. So there's churches there that are Byzantium with that style of painting, you know, where they see the halo around them. I'm sure, yeah, certain style. So really, as Rome collapses, it goes to Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire comes all the way back up to here. But really what happens with all these little city-states, sorry, I just wanted to finish one other point first. And that is the one other bilingual area is going north up through Trento and these areas. They actually speak both Italian and German, right? And you're getting up into the German-speaking countries, Austria and Switzerland and Liechtenstein are straight north of you there. So that's important to remember as well, just for a lot of reasons, because the German story does come into Italy a great deal, or the Germanic tribes, as we call them. So as the Roman Empire collapses in on itself, as it does, basically, what happens is all those old roads, like Paris, for example, was back at that time. Paris was founded over 2,000 years ago, but it was a small Celtic group. Paris, that's why it's called Paris. But again, these are all Roman places all the way up through and up into what is now modern Germany. But as Rome kind of collapses in on itself, probably because of internal mismanagement. But I mean, the empire lasted years, like hundreds of years. And it's pretty spectacular in its own way. But as they collapse in, then the local leaders everywhere take over, and that's the birth of what we call the feudal system, right? and you've all studied feudalism, you've heard of it, but the idea, the basic principle of feudalism is that there's a lord or a prince or whomever it is, who probably is tithing, who probably is linked to someone superior somewhere else, that they guarantee your protection. But the trade-off of that is you supply them with food and money and everything. So that's where you get your really classic historic towns of the beautiful walled cities up on some high point, and then farmland around it. Remember, again, for most overwhelming part of our history, we're farm to table. Right? You literally ate at night what you're able to grow or catch or hunt, but mostly grow. And so that's where all of those tiny little city states and so forth that are all up and down through Germany, not France so much, we'll get into that, but that's really down through Central Europe. It's places like Switzerland come together, the Vierwaldstättensee, where the four cantons come together in the middle, say we're going to have a union to protect each other, basically little feudal states that come together and become friends, and they expand it out. Right? Well, Italy breaks down basically into that as well. So you had Lombardy, with a king or a prince up here in Milan, you have all these things, but remember the one role that was important is that as Christianity declines and Constantine accepts Christianity, or as Rome declines and people convert to Christianity really en masse, then you have the gradual rise of the papacy. And I'm sure you've read lots of papal history, but you've heard things like the Great Schism. Do you remember when there were two popes for a while? The French tried to put one in Avignon. And up there's actually, yeah. So yeah, that's actually a different story, but it's still a great story. So you have the rise of the papacy, and that's the church. They have the Great Schism. That's the first between the Orthodox Church. Yeah, and so it's not called a pope, but yes, you've got the Orthodox Church that was based. Yeah, and it depends on the language as well, because you've got the right now in terms of the Orthodox Church. Boy, there's so many million good conversations here. Basically, Serbia is Orthodox, Croatia is Catholic.
My dad's from Serbia.
That's true, yeah. And then Bosnia split between the three. So a Croatian and a Serb and a Bosnian can all talk to each other. Like they're remarkably the same people. But you have the Orthodox Church in there in Serbia. Then of course you have the Ukrainian Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Greek Orthodox, which is what you would have had in Constantinople. But of course that disappeared with the arrival of the Seljuk Turks. I was in Mostar just a few months ago. That was the city, if you remember back in the horrible wars in Yugoslavia, where they call it Sniper Alley. And it's a gorgeous town now, well, mostly gorgeous, still have burnt out buildings. But on the western side of the city of Mostar, you have the tallest Catholic spire in the whole country. The middle of the city, which is walkable in 10 minutes, are minarets, they're mosques. And then on the eastern side, there's an Orthodox Serbian church up there. And, and that's how tribal it is still today in Bosnia. Bosnia and Herzegovina is super complicated, as you can imagine. Yeah, we should chit chat about some of this after, because you still see, just because I was just there and I hadn't been back for a few years, it's been interesting to see the development. But the papacy takes over in Rome, and this is where we now introduce, starting in about the 800s, the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, right? That is born, and remember I said we mentioned this, with Charlemagne. So Charlemagne comes from over in what is now southern France, and in an area which, by the way, you need to take a trip to at some point. I'll try, should be almost exactly where it is. You see where Bordeaux is coming in, but up in that area. Glasses on. You get into these areas, and there's a place called Rocamadour, and that's where the first kings of France are buried. But they literally go out and start putting crowns on people, or the papacy came to Charlemagne, put a crown on his head, and said he's the king of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a way of legitimizing papacy. Right, so that becomes a big political move. So that is where we see this as the decline of the Roman Empire, and yet the rise of feudalism, and the real breakdown of trade and everything. Things really shrink down in on themselves at that point. I just don't know. Not funny. It's a trip totally worth doing. But you go into Rocamadour, and that's where all those early kings are buried. But yeah, the papacy comes, and by saying to Charlemagne, "You are the Holy Roman Emperor," and France was more unified, then really the papacy, what they're saying to the world is, we're the ones who legitimize leadership, right? Pretty interesting kind of politics that way. And so that's why Rome itself becomes this very important place. And I'm presuming some of you are Catholics, and you still with push call yourself a Roman Catholic, right? Because otherwise, and that becomes relevant in all of Europe, really right up to Martin Luther and so forth. And that's very important. But as the Roman Empire declines, and as Constantine moves over to Constantinople, then really what happens is these big Germanic migrations that come down. So genetically or ethnically, both a Greek or Italian today would have very little in direct common to a Greek or an Italian 2,000 years ago. Like there's just so much more mixing that happened. But that's you've always heard the groups of the Visigoths and so forth coming down. Well, they came much further north because the Swiss and the Austrians, particularly in the mountain areas, are actually more Celtic people. They're more Celts, and they look that way rather than being that kind of Germanic people. But that's what moves down into Italy, and then you're down in these different little city-states. Now, Lombardy up in the north here was always fairly big and important, but the real money in Europe, as we're getting up through those middle years, the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, great big France. Britain still isn't that important in the game, and Spain was very poor until they go off, and of course they're fighting the Moors most of the time. But Italy are just these little, it would have been pretty conservative, right? Pretty Catholic, pretty, well, to this day even, pretty traditional. And you had different series of allegiances back and forth, which one way or another is tied to the Holy Roman Empire, but the Holy Roman Empire doesn't have a lot of say. I can't remember the exact year, but there's someone up north, somewhere around Milan, that kind of was the last one to use the term Holy Roman Emperor, and that kind of descends in on itself. Now, then what's forming further north, Switzerland just forms to not be bothered by everybody else, right? So again, northern Italy is its own kind of kingdom. Genoa is an independent city, which is a trading city. And Venice is actually controlling, Venice is going all the way down to places like Dubrovnik. Like Venice was a big trading city. And that's where we talk about Marco Polo, for example, going to China. There's quite a lot of debate whether he actually went. Well, he failed to mention things like a giant wall. Like, wouldn't that be like the first thing you tell people about? Although, yeah, so he definitely did some trade, but that's because what we do forget about is what was happening, and I think it'd be a fabulous trip to do sometime, is you had the whole Silk route. Yeah, the Silk Road right through the stands. But you know what the Silk Road really followed? It was the Mongol route. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Mongols make it all the way up to what is now Budapest at one point, but really Kiev, I mean, they killed everyone in Kiev, or Kiev, and stacked all the heads, but they always let one person survive to tell a story. And the way Mongols attacked is they were the best horse riders, right? Yeah, they'd circle, but they always offered an escape route. And usually people would try and run, and so you get them as they're running. But what the Mongols did do is they moved information back and forth across the longest continent. I mean, basically the length of Russia today, right? And they didn't really, as long as you paid allegiance or something, they didn't care about your religion. Quite a different attitude than so many others. So, they're the one herding empire the world ever had. But that's where Venice starts to get on that incredible trade route. And as the trade starts to build up in these two bodies of water, which really makes sense, already by the 8th century, you then have Islam to the south, right? And Islam was going through a fabulous period of education at that point. So everything had kind of declined here in Rome, in former, well, what was Italy, or I guess the States at that point, but down in places across North Africa is where you had the high level of mathematics. They famously say that the Muslims invented zero, which I just think means nothing. Algebra, AL, whenever you see that, it's a word. Although the Mayans had it too, by the way. Mayans had it independent. So that's another fun conversation. So you have that down to the south, but then you start to have wealth increasing up further north in Europe, mostly after the plague period. So the 1300s, they had the series of bubonic plagues. Another thing I haven't even mentioned throughout all this are the attacks on the Holy Land, the Crusades, which it was the third or fourth. They didn't even make it to Israel. They made it to Constantinople and stole things and burnt buildings. So, but that's relevant all the way from the north. So again, everything was driven for that 1,000-year period, really either driven or justified by faith. And again, Rome was always the center. So even though it wasn't that important economically, it was always that focal point, and the Pope played this important role. And that's why France tried to move papacy. They just wanted to control it because France is much more unified. So, again, that's another bit of history. It is theorized my whole life. It was always said that it was rats on ships coming to Genoa that brought in the bubonic plague. But a recent article was saying that it turns out it might not be the poor lowly rat. It was fleas that were actually carrying the plague. But this plague story, now, we just got through a pandemic, and boy, oh boy, were we lucky. Like the R rate or whatever you call it, the death rate is about 0.62 or 0.67%. We didn't know, right? I mean, that first year, but we need to remember what plagues are, because the bubonic plague, you're talking about 20 to 50% of your community dying in a few days. I mean, just wiping out. So that's why Ring Around a Rosie, that's that song. It's about the plague. Pocket full of posy, achoo, achoo, we all fall down. Right? Yep. And and it still shows up every now and then, plague, but it can be treated with antibiotics. But this is something I say often.
Oh, Washington State.
Oh.
Please.
That's very interesting, yeah. And it's and I do know we're seeing a rise in a lot of things because of course some people are now refusing to get any kind of vaccine, so they're really worried about smallpox and stuff coming back. If you can go back in history, now some people think they want to go back and live in previous days. Don't go back before antibiotics. Life was super, super hard. And if you were injured, that was pretty much the end of you. And I do want to talk about food as well back in time. But yeah, so the plague comes into Europe, and as you go north, most people were pretty poor. But life changes when everyone around you is dying. Right? I mean, this is pretty fundamental, and you really, really believe you're probably going to die pretty unpleasantly too, quickly. Well, as the population is just getting wiped out across Europe, and this is the same time as we talked about yesterday, the day before, that was the mini ice age. So people weren't that fit either because you had less food. People are dying off en masse, but there was a demand suddenly to try and enjoy your life. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die. And so suddenly you had a demand for trade. Well, these Roman or these Italian towns were the good places to start to import things. And I mean, it wasn't a ton of stuff, but they started bringing things in from Asia along the Silk Route. So, I mean, it's interesting how you start to see those economies boom because of that. But what do you think, if we're going back to the 14th century and the 15th century, what do you think they're eating here? Or if we go back 2,000 years, what are people eating kind of as their regular food? Yeah, lamb probably would have been a big part of it. Fish, although it's interesting, in Homer's Odyssey, they talk about eating fish as like the last resort. So, but what they weren't eating was pasta and tomato sauce. Tomatoes come from Mexico, right? They were Aztec. Pasta comes from China. Yep. Potatoes come from Peru. So much of what Europeans are eating today. But they found in Pompeii, and of course, beautiful, well, interesting Pompeii, it's right just outside of Naples. They found a fresco recently, and this got all over the news, and it looks like a pizza, but it's not. It was actually olives and some chilies or whatever things. So olives were one of your biggest sources, and that's why we talk so much about olive oil and the Mediterranean diet. So there's a lot of that kind of food. So modern Italian food, which some people consider to be among the best food in the world, and teach their own. We all have personal taste. I say that because I'm not a huge pasta eater, for example. Teach their own. Some people love it, but the lovely focaccia bread and the hand rolled pizzas and all that sort of thing. Sure, I do like that. But it's a matter of personal taste, what you particularly love. But definitely right back from the earliest days, you had massive production of olives. In fact, that's part of the reason Greece is so dry and it's so rocky, the hills, is olive trees. Part of the reason olive is so healthy is it sucks up pretty much all the nutrients out of the ground, right? As they pull it up. And so next time then you'll see, if you go to Italy, you'll see all the big olive plantations, but you see very little growing around them. You know, maybe a little bit of grass or something. And you see that very much in Spain and Portugal as well, where all the olives are produced, but they are very good for you. So that's one thing. And then grapes, right? So vines everywhere. And it is untrue when we go back in history. Sometimes people will say, you know, water was unsafe to drink, so everybody was continuously drunk, you know, beer. That's just not true, because you had wells, and the Italians moved water. I mean, they moved water incredibly. When you get back to some of those old Roman ruins, this is something we don't do this day and age now. People all went to the toilet together. So Ephesus is one of the great places, which is now in Turkey, but Ephesus, Mary, Mother Christ went up there. So it's, you know, a famous place to see. So classic Roman Empire, but they still have the toilets there. And, you know, all holes, they had running water, heated seats. They're as good as a Japanese toilet, except for you sat cheek to cheek with your buddy beside you. And apparently very common to discuss what was happening. So, hey, how things changed over time. But the Roman Empire clearly cared about cleanliness, like personal cleanliness, because water was an important thing. So people did have access to water. One thing I forgot to mention the other day about Portugal, and I wanted to mention it, is the Portuguese were the ones who brought tobacco from the Americas. I really resist saying the New World, because it wasn't new to the people who lived here, but they brought tobacco. And they did it because they thought it was a treatment for gout. Oh, didn't work. So all the wealthier people had gout because they had meat, but you preserved your meat, and you still get the lovely dried sausage and calabrese, you know, those ones in Italy. I love that stuff, but I really try not to eat it too much. It's all full of sulfates, and you know. But if you were eating that and drinking wine all day long, you were getting gout. Yeah, I mean, they say that gout is really what killed Columbus. Said it was so bad, he was suffering for 10 years. His eyes would be bleeding. Like, yeah. Yeah, so but they thought tobacco might treat it. So then probably the biggest killer in European history is probably tobacco. You know, they certainly say in World War I, because everyone got the rum rations and the tobacco rations in the trenches, that probably more soldiers had died because of tobacco use over the years. That's, you know, fascinating kind of history. But the later, oh, that's great. The later period was you start to get up into the 19th century, and this does become interesting. So as you get into the late 1800s, so France had gone through, I think it was probably in its third of 5 republics by that point. You know, France descends into revolution in 1789, and they bankrupted themselves supporting American independence, because really they've been fighting Britain so much, right? And then the United States, you have your beautiful Declaration of Independence, but the famous Constitution, the modern Constitution of the US goes to 1789, right? Because the early one, the states were so independent, it wasn't working. So they get together and rewrite this Constitution. And that's exactly the time that France erupts into its revolution, because basically you had a tiny elite all stuck around Versailles, and everyone else was desperately poor. And that was really what was happening in France. So there's one big empire. Spain was still rocking. Spain was still just making tons of money off of South America, the Royal Fifth. What was the other big empire at that time? Britain, yes, but it's not kind of playing ball with everyone. But by the time you're in the 1800s, the British elite would go down often to Greece to study. They felt that was an academic thing. And the British were actually down in Malta as well, that island in the middle. Note the other really important ones right here, Austria. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so it was kind of in everybody's interest in its own way to keep Germany all broken apart and to keep Italy kind of broken apart. So Italy just wasn't playing, you know, I mean, Rome was, and they were called the Papal States at that point. So they were really kind of independent states, but that's because the Vatican was there. But Germany was still this whole series of well, Prussia was growing. Prussia's further north, but Austro-Hungary. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire was massive, and its border, your dad know all about this. If you look at the border right now between Croatia and Bosnia, that was essentially its border with Turkey, with the Ottoman Turk Empire. Remember, so the Turkish Empire was massive, And the Turkish Empire was, it seems, they say, treated minorities better. Like Jewish people could be openly Jewish because I mean, in Europe, having the pogroms and everything like that. And that's why Jews ended up at places like Venice, because small city state made its own decisions. Whereas up in Northern Europe, they kept, every place kept expelling the Jews because they used Jews as ways of trading money, and then they didn't want to pay them back. So they blamed them for everything, kicked them out. And then, of course, you had this big, messy, poor, weird thing, which is the whole Russian Empire under the Tsars. And why am I saying big, messy, and poor? Because 85% of the population were serfs. So you have your old feudal states, imagine, except for the size of Russia, right? So that's what Europe looks like as you're getting up into the later 1800s. And so the decisions were made. Prussia reaches out to all these little German speaking areas, and they unified under an emperor, but really it's Bismarck was the brains behind it. And Italy then reorganizes itself in the 1860s, and that's when Europe really starts to have the massive industrial revolution. So the industrial revolution, I'm sure you all know, all starts up in England, and it's kind of unique that such a small space did it, or such a distant country, but it's nice rolling green hills up through central England. It was very good for building canals, which is how the US Industrial Revolution really started as well. And you'd have horses that could come along and pull the barges up. And then they got the steam and the trains and the whole bit. So, the oldest underground railway in the world is the Metro in London, or the London Underground. And the first one on the continent was actually Budapest. So they all started industrializing, and northern Italy started to industrialize really very efficiently in that same period that Europe was industrializing. And it did so, sorry, I'm just getting this dot away because I don't want it there. Go away. There. I don't know why I really wanted to tell me it was there. So it really begins to industrialize as there's a great deal of trade. Incidentally, Switzerland was not industrial, and people didn't need a lot of offshore banking, but mostly the Swiss were just saying, leave us alone. And so everyone was doing military service, and so they became mercenaries. And that's why today the Swiss Guard are the guards in the Vatican, because they were mercenaries. They were hired to go and protect. Yeah. So what you would do in Switzerland is you'd come home in the summer to farm, but of course it's a beautiful country, but all the big mountains. So in the winter, snow came, you go off and work as a mercenary. And in Lucerne, there's the monument of a lion, and it was Swiss Guard who were told to put down their arms, and they were all killed. So that's one of those. I mean, it's the war, I'm sure, was awful, but the bit of art is really beautiful. So that's that Swiss relation. So Switzerland's kind of unique in the whole thing. Austro-Hungary, though, was really the first multicultural empire, and it was having problem after problem after problem. So much so that you have the Serbian nationalists who want Serbia to they were busy having war after war after war breaking away from the Ottoman Empire, which at this point around 1900 is called the sick man of Europe, or the old man of Europe. The Ottoman Empire had been very successful. Part of their problem is the Sultan, so like the emperor, was so afraid that the next in line would take over that their siblings would be locked up in solitary confinement. So unless they got out, they were crazy. So that was interesting. But they also wanted to get independence in the Bosnian area from Austria, and Archduke Ferdinand was down there for a meeting, and a Serb nationalist shoots him. Now, if you study, and I'm sure it's still taught this way, the rise of World War I, it's always taught that it was the failure of alliances. And this is how it's always taught. And it's not that it's not true, it's just a lot more complicated. But so France had a deal to protect with Russia. They had to protect each other. And that's because of Austria out in the middle. And of course, a unified Germany now, which had already gone to war with France and took Alsace-Lorraine, this area down through here. It also attacked Austria. They'd gone out and kind of attacked everyone and then pulled back. That was their announcement that they're in the world. Italy didn't get involved in these fights, so that's quite interesting. But France had a mutual protection thing with Russia. Austria and Germany had a mutual protection thing with each other and with the Turks because of all the problems down through here. Britain was staying out of it because they were busy by this time with their massive empire. They'd lost you, but they had India, and India was worth an awful lot of money. But they guaranteed Belgian neutrality. So when after Archduke Ferdinand was killed, and the story is, they made a wrong turn. They came down and because they weren't where they were going to be, so the assassins were like, we've lost the opportunity, and suddenly they're walking down the street in the car and taking a wrong turn. They walked up. Anyway, so the because of this issue, and because Serbia, being Orthodox, was guaranteed by Russia, they felt the Austrians, who had lost their heir to the throne, had to attack. So they attacked Serbia. Serbia then is attacked, or Austro-Hungary is attacked by Russia because they're protecting Serbia. That draws France into the war. But because Austria has now been attacked, Germany comes to the defense of Austria. So they decide to attack France, and in doing so, they cut through Belgium, violating Belgian neutrality, and that brings England into the war. This is World War I, yeah, and that's 1914. So that all of that happens, and little unified Italy, which is industrializing hugely in the north and in the south, is not at all, and it's very poor. And people are emigrating like mad to the United States and Canada, but really Argentina and South America. Italy is part of the Entente. It's part of the partnership with France. So it was kind of one. I don't think there was a good guy in World War I. I mean, it's just the whole thing is awful. But at the end of the war, that war ends in 1918. You'll see lots of monuments say 1919 because there were still legions out. I will argue that World War I doesn't even end until 1923. And that's because Greece and Italy keep fighting. Greece and Turkey. And Turkey then turns into a modern state under Ataturk. Do you know any of that history? So they drop, like they switch to the Latin alphabet, the whole bit, but basically they kick out well over 1 million Greeks, and the Greeks are kicking out all the Turks because everybody was mixed in here. And that war keeps playing out to the 1990s, in my opinion. I mean, that's what the Yugoslav war was. Still was kind of tribal, right? And that's the rise of the nation state. So I know we're covering out. We'll get back into the fun stuff about Italy in a minute, but that's the rise of the nation state. And with that comes a rise of a movement and fascism. And Italy, which was considered very, very disorganized, very peculiar little man named Mussolini, Benito Mussolini, comes to power in 1922, very early, right? So he takes over as El Duce, as the supreme leader. And the old story is he made the trains run on time. So they're industrializing. He takes over, creates this fascist state. Now, I want to say one nice thing about Italians is that even though he, of course, had a deep relationship with Franco and, of course, with Hitler, and the Vatican celebrated Hitler's birthday, by the way. But even though he had all of that going on, the Italians didn't get so much into the hard racism that the Nazis did. You know, they believed in fascism as that idea that we all have to be organized because we're disorganized. It was sort of that idea, but you didn't get the really virulent anti-Semitism, that kind of thing that you did see, well, obviously Germany and Austria and Lithuania and places like that. So it's just an interesting comment, right? And it's not, I mean, Italy under fascism was not great, but he is in power for quite a long time. I mean, 22, you know, you're not seeing Hitler getting into power really till the 30s, right? And then of course, Franco in 36. So that's really the rise of fascism, and it's an Italian word. And of course, with it is tied into this idea of the glories of the Roman Empire, which is exactly what the Renaissance was too. Like, and when we see all the modern statues from the 17th and 18th century that are always the white, you know, artistic statues that they're trying to copy the ones back from the Roman days, at the time of the empire, they would have been painted. So it's faded off. And so, and things like Colosseum would have been covered in marble. I mean, they would have been spectacular buildings to see. But imagine for your age, I guess people watch that Ultimate Fighting now. I guess it's pretty similar, you know, both fights. I mean, imagine what you do for a weekend is to go watch people get killed by lions and stuff. Yeah, very odd. So that's the rise of it. But coming World War II, Italy really went out to get itself an empire. So it conquers poor Albania. Albania's not had a very easy go of it. Albania is the only Muslim majority country in Europe, but it's not very religious, but they're conquered. But Italy was south. You may or may not know that Italy controlled Libya. So Libya, poor Libya. So that was all Italian, Tripoli being the main city. Of course, Libya today is only a few million people, but they go in and they had a section of Somalia. And there was also, Djibouti was French, this was the English part, and so they had Mogadishu down here. And then they invade in the 30s, they invade Ethiopia. Ethiopia was the one country under Haile Selassie which had maintained independence in Europe. I have great respect for the Ethiopian people. The Italians go down there and conquer it, but not very well. You know, the Ethiopians really held off. So that's kind of what absorbed Italy leading into World War II. But they were already aligned with this big fascist movement. And this is why I think it's really important to remember, don't align with dictators. It's just, you can see the stuff rising up. But Mussolini was a great orator. He had the balconies lowered at the presidential palace in Rome because he was quite short, so minimum 12. The balconies here, it's, you know, but he did, they did have a fairly efficient navy, for example, and they should have because they were a maritime nation. But for example, the British at that point were inventing radar. The Italians were working on it, and he cut the funding for it. He said, "Why would I want radar? I can't put that in a parade." And so they never understood why the British ships were waiting for, you know. So, but Italy, yeah, enters the war on the side, of course, of the Germans, the Axis powers, and is very heavily involved in Northern Europe or Northern Africa. The French, of course, legionnaires and stories, but Tobruk, I don't know if you know those stories, the rats in Tobruk, a lot of Australians died in there, but they were fighting as many Italians as they would have been Germans. But this was one of the places where the West started to liberate Europe. Of course, we always talk about the Norman invasions. Is the Russians, of course, lose hands down to most people, like what they went through. But there were invasions in the south here, up through Italy. So Rome was liberated by 1943. So that's actually a form of civil war. They eventually grab Mussolini and kill him and hang him up in the square in Milan. So then Italy switches over. I wish I had brought it. I actually have a 1944 Italian lira note, but it's written in English because it was actually military money. And yeah, a lot of Canadians went up to there, but you know, a lot of fighting as they liberated Italy. So Italy then, right after the war, I mean, obviously they end fascism, and a lot of people had opposed it, but this is the thing about fascism. When you elect someone who's never going to have another election, that's how they become a dictator, right? Really matters. So they then have a referendum, and in 1946, they get rid of the monarchy and they establish themselves as a republic. And that is our modern Italy today, that's born out of that. And I just knew in the time we had, I mean, to try and cover all of this history is massive. But let's just talk a little bit about modern Italy itself. It is beautiful country. I mean, and in a really fortunate way for it. It's just there's so many gorgeous natural features. The whole Alps area is really just spectacularly beautiful. The cities are nice, although you're going to be down by Naples. Naples 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Naples has a lot of issues, but they had a garbage strike for like 8 months. Yeah. So that's a bit tough. Last year, was it? Last year, the year before. Oh no, it was the Giro d'Italia. You know, the Tour de France, the big bike race, they did Giro d'Italia. That one began down, spent several days in Sicily. And that was really neat to watch because I always watch those bike races in so many different towns. I've only been to Sicily twice, I guess, in my life. I did tons of tours to Europe when I was first living there, or to Italy. We used to London, Paris, Rome, or Florence. So Florence, of course, you know, it depends on your taste. Florence is pretty, Siena, you know, they're interesting cities, but they're densely populated cities. You know, people live together because that goes back to that feudal state where everything's kind of in a circle where you come in and hide. But they were very trade oriented. But the physical country is gorgeous. And down the spine of the middle of it, of course, you have all those hilltop towns. So that's a nice thing. Italians are a very proud people. Should we put it that way? They themselves, and I'm being recorded, so what do I say? It's there can be, there's a style to Italians, and there it can come across sometimes as sort of an arrogance, and it maybe is because you're, you know, there's an important way to present yourself and hold yourself and all of that. But there's also, you know, a warmth and a lovingness that Italians have within themselves and for other people. So, you know, but because it's actually quite a small country in terms of the areas you can live in, 60 million people is a lot of people. The modern infrastructure is very impressive. Very good motorways. Everything's toll roads. Everything's tolls, and the train systems and all this. And they're all partly because, of course, they have had a much higher level of corruption, which then loses faith in government. And that leads us, of course, to talk about the mafia, right? And it's not the whole country. but southern Italy for years has been under, but decades and generations, hundreds of years, under the thumbs of these little family units. And there's one, I'd have to Google his name, but there's one magistrate or lawyer, something, judge, who is really closing down the biggest last mafia family. And it's amazing. This guy has no life. He lives in an armed compound, right? But he is going after them and literally step by step and dismantling it all. I mean, it is amazing. And if you go back to the, say, the 20s, the 30s, certainly Prohibition, right? The mafia was heavily involved. So were the Irish, so were all sorts of things, but the mafia were heavily involved. It is once said to me, and it'd be interesting to see how true it is, but the real end of the mafia in New York and places like that, the United States, one of the arguments was actually minimum wage. Suddenly when people had good living wages at a normal job, you didn't need to go be an enforcer for the mafia. Like a pretty awful job to do, right? Like when your job is to go club people on the knees or be, or I could just get a job, get a job at a university, earn a good living and retire. So that's really, and when you're down in southern Italy, nothing will happen to you. Nobody, like you wouldn't even feel it. But in behind the businesses, they're getting rid of all these rackets and the protection money and just everything that has held the area back, the region back for just generations, and generations and generations. So that is an important change that is happening in Italy, and it's been their longest. And I assure you, I mean, you've got Russian mafia everywhere. So much mafia and oligarch stuff came out of Yugoslavia. It's just probably most famous in Italian history, I would think. So on the upside, you have this real sense of living well, eating well and how to live a good, healthy here, not healthy necessarily, but a good life, to enjoy life. And then on the other side, you have this kind of extremely traditional, because even the mafia all pretend to be, very good Catholics and everything, but very peculiar rules and code systems. So, there's a lot to unpack there, but it would be well worth, before you go down to the southern area, you get a sense of older Italy for sure when you're down there, in a beautiful way too. But on the other hand, to read some of that history about the rise of the mafia, I could easily look up a few different books about that. But we don't actually have too long. I don't have anything right after this, but what would you like to talk about? What questions or ideas? Because we can just have a nice back. I mean, you have been to Italy, some of you?
Yeah.
No? Yeah. Whereabouts? And Piedmont, yeah.
Northern down to maybe Rome.
Yeah.
And Rome was my least favorite place.
Right.
I like the hills and the Tuscany area. in Piedmont.
Yeah, so Piedmont, it means the foot of the hills. That's what that means, right? So the foothills, that's all up through here. I really like Turin and that Val d'Aosta. I really enjoy that area. And I really enjoyed it, all of those. Like I like the food, I like the scenery, I like the activities, big cycling culture. Then Florence, and to all my fans of Florence, I think I just went a little off Florence because I used to do those student tours, and I would get down to Florence and then you'd have all day, but our hotel wouldn't be anywhere near the center. And I've had too many days where I'm walking around Florence for like 6 hours. It may be famous, but there's only so much you want to do. And of course, there's only so much ice cream you can eat in a day. Although Florence is one of my favorite places to eat because they have the Fiorentina steak. It's basically a T-bone. So you get a nice starter where you get handmade ravioli and then you get the steak. It's lovely. Rome is interesting. So and I do understand when you say that you found Rome a little bit harder. Heather, what month are you guys going?
October.
Perfect, October, yeah. The summer, Rome is really hot in the summer.
In Jersey.
And yet it's dirty because it's actually quite industrial around the outside of it. And so when you're getting up to 40 degrees Celsius, 100 Fahrenheit, like when I used to do my tours there, I would be doing a walking tour in late afternoon. And I mean, I was cooking, right? And and then of course, so many of the sites, and this is not the fault of the Italians or the French or us in the mountains, all these places, there's just too many tourists. And so, one of a good example, because I was just in June, I was just back in Paris. I mean, I lived in Paris, I studied there, like I know and I had a private family with me, so I took them up to Montmartre to have the experience, where the artists paint, to go for dinner. And it used to be you'd go around and look at the menus on the outside and pick your nice little, now it was just finding a seat. Like literally, there's one there, we're eating there. And I have a friend who lives in Paris. I mean, in fact, when I was 19 years old, she was my girlfriend. Isn't that lovely? And we've kept in touch till well, it was Facebook. But she lives in Montmartre. And so we chatted, and it was really neat to chat. And she said, like, I'm glad the tourists are here. I mean, she doesn't work with that. She actually works with the poorest refugees. She's a very good person. But she said sometimes from her apartment, she can't see ground because so many people are together, right? So it's a really good thing to move into travel more in shoulder season. But and they do get remarkably hot down here in Italy. So that said, Rome is a fascinating city, right? I mean, it is fascinating. There's so much there. And if you get the right time of year, like I say, I'm flying to Venice in about a month, not even 3 weeks. But I will go over after I'm doing what I'm doing, a private trip. I'm going to go over and see a buddy, friend of mine who is British, but hiding. He's the only person on earth who has a London Blue Badge guide and a Rome City guide. So when we're teaching this course tomorrow about international tourism, we're videoing him in, and he went because he married a woman who's Roman. They live 300 meters from the Vatican, and so I've stayed with him before. He's a skier, so he comes over and sees me every few years. But they're right in Rome, and to go around Rome with him for a day is just so much fun, right? To see it. But yeah, I find some of the tours in Rome itself, I mean, it's fascinating, but I mean, you do the Vatican when you have to the Vatican, right? I mean, you have a time ticket and you go in. I'll tell you back, and things have changed. But back in the days when Italy was really corrupt, I remember the local guides, you know, I'd have the budget for the tickets, because it used to be everything was cash in Italy. Now it's just as modern as anything. It's tap into card, all that's easy. But in those old days, I would have these huge wads of lira to pay for everything for the groups. And we'd go up to the ticket window, and the local guide would say to the Swiss guard behind, there are 40 people, whatever it was, but he would put it in as all, say, the senior's price or the child's price, and then they'd split the difference. Like that's how corrupt it was. Yeah, that stuff happened. And then it used to really infuriate me. I made a decision years ago, guiding, maybe this is why I've survived in the job for so long, is I just don't do like taking people into the shops and stuff like that. Out where we live, it doesn't even exist. But in Italy, it was always one of those places where you're, you know, taken to a shop to see something and they kind of lock the door behind you. The Vatican one always made me most angry because they take you to the Vatican shop, and genuinely, you always had Catholics on your bus, like they wanted to get a rosary. But, you know, they say, this is the break for an hour. It's like an hour in the shop, you know, and they say, but the Pope will have it blessed for you by tomorrow. And the Pope was in Indonesia. Like the Pope was not blessing your rosary, right? So there's that element, but I have so many nice things to say. But I would say in the big cities in Italy, it is a place where you want to watch your pockets and all that same kind of safety thing. No, there's not a personal risk. The other thing that I dislike in a lot of these parts of Europe is they always tell you about the gypsies. First of all, the gypsies aren't people. There's a gypsy culture basically in Romania, but there's whole towns in southern France. They were also Hitler's final solution, tried to include them, he tried to wipe them off the earth. You do see some people that are historically dressed that way. I just think it's such an awful thing when local guides or other tourists say you have to specifically watch out for them, right? I mean, anyone who comes up and starts to try and get at your bag, but otherwise it just feels so much like racism because you know, it kind of is. So that's an interesting thing. When you get south, so often, Sicily, by the way, is gorgeous. But where I think the tour, when I was looking at the itinerary, really it's an eating and drinking event. And down here, I mean, you don't have to eat seafood. Although usually even at the breakfast bar, you'll always see the anchovies, but the salty ones, not the ones I was talking about in Spain. I like them. But this is all through these areas is where they make prosciutto, you know, the cured ham, right? Or Serrano ham over, and I mean, things like that are just delicious. One thing that shows up a lot of food, I didn't look at all the menus on the tour, but one thing that shows up a lot are truffles. Now, do you like truffles?
We went truffle hunting.
You went truffle hunting?
in-
Yeah. I was gonna do it, but I felt like I was gonna be a pig. So truffles come, I mean, this is the truffle part of the world. Interestingly enough, it's actually out in Istria, I showed you earlier. I just did a truffle lunch there. Now, I'm allergic to mushrooms, so I do not eat. Yeah. Do you know why everyone likes to hang out with the mushroom? because he's a fun guy. But we did this lunch and I literally had to leave the room. So 35 to 40% of people have a visceral dislike of truffles. 40% of people think it's the most delicious thing on earth, and 20% can't smell them or taste them. And it's really pheromones that get, and some people react, and they're true pheromones. I mean, that's the thing. It's an aphrodisiac to pigs. Yeah.
So what is it? Is it a mushroom?
It's a mushroom. Yeah, yeah. And I actually brought some home on my last trip for my son because he loves mushrooms and he's a
See,
great
I always
person.
thought it was a chocolate.
Oh, yeah, they're truffle. Yeah, there are chocolate truffles, which is just another name and a slightly different word. So it's a great question because yes, there is a chocolate, absolutely. Tiramisu, by the way, comes from Rome as well, you know, the famous dessert. And if you want to go get that, you go to Piazza Navona. And Piazza Navona is where the old racing track is, right in the center of Rome. So there's actually really nice, like if you could come with me for 3 days to Rome, I think you'd end up really liking it because you have to find the jewels and not just have one of these punishing 8-hour tours. You know, it's the local guides are very well paid there. But I mean, I walked around times at the Colosseum, which everyone is excited to see. And by 20 minutes later, I'm like, I just can't listen to this guy. And I love learning this stuff, you know. So, but that's so much of the travel experience, isn't it? But you need to, Italy is fun if you can take it at a bit of a slower pace and actually just enjoy some of these things. I feel the same way about Venice. I mean, you know, in the early days when I'd go to Venice, I'd be there with tour groups, and I was young too, and you arrive, it's so exciting to see the boats. But then, you know, you're hauled around to all these things, and there's really no time to kind of just listen to the sounds of it. So, you know, it's nice to take a bit of a slower pace. Italy is a good country for that. Now, Italy is one of the most visited countries in the world. People love it, and they love it for lots of different reasons, because that same integral diversity we've talked about in the whole thing. You know, people are going up to Milan are usually interested in fashion. People are going to Rome, of course, is the history and even the name Rome. And, you know, and then you get down to Sicily, and people go there to watch volcanoes erupting and to drink nice, hearty wines. The wines get heartier and fuller as you get south because it's hotter. Right, so there's lots of reasons, and then Sardinia for just the sheer beauty of it. So great diversity. The Adriatic side is visited a little bit less, which is funny because now on the other side, it's very, very visited. You know, Croatia, and Brindisi is down here. That's you take the ferries over to Greece. I think you're going to Bari on the tour. That's a nice town. I've been there for years, but it's really nice, and they're all quite agricultural. So as you move south of Rome, I think that's why they do a culinary tour down there, because it's less industrial, much more agricultural, which means much more that farm to table.
So if you were looking to eat in Italy, maybe more healthy diet, salads, fruits, things like that. What do you think?
It's a great question. Lois is just asking about a healthier diet. So you don't, I mean, you can easily have like a small bowl of pasta or something, but salads are very common. And salads often will be eaten later on in the meal, kind of like a cleansing of the palate. Not a ton of meat, right? I mean, you know, it depends where you're from, how much of a meat eater you are. It's not really easy to be vegetarian there. You can do it like with pastas and things, but they've always had, I mean, Italians are pretty healthy. And I say that because there's always the exceptions. You imagine the big old Italian fellow with his cigarettes and having the, you know, the pasta, but really, I mean, it's, you know, pretty active, pretty healthy society. Breakfast is very, very, very light, usually. Just, I mean, honestly, like a dried croissant or something, but coffee, dip it in. So they're not a big breakfast culture at all. But then when you get up around lunchtime, you'll find salad on all the menus. Excuse me. You'll find salad on all the menus. You'll find a lot of bread, but then I'm not afraid of bread. So, you know, I like a nice focaccia. But yeah, it's a good question. I really feel as though you can eat.
That's one of my concerns, because both in Spain and in Italy, apparently they eat a lot of smoked.
Lot of cured meats.
Cured meats, but I want to kind of stay away from that.
Yes.
More salads and fruits.
Yeah, I mean, fruit is around everywhere. And watermelon is a very common thing. Now, I know there's not a lot of nutrients in watermelon, but particularly in the summer, in the evenings at the end of a party, or they'll go to the beach and eat watermelon. Lovely thing historically to cool your body off before you sleep, because it does get quite hot long before air conditioning. So that kind of thing is quite easy as well. Italy's not cheap, distinctly so. but you really do get what you pay for in Italy when it comes to food as well. So at the higher end food, like veal, I really like veal, and veal marsala. I mean, lovely things like that, but nice sized portions. You get the bread's interesting because a lot of the bread are those dry long sticks. You'll often have them sitting out on the table. Again, the olives and all of that, it's very easy to have lighter food if you fancy it. But yeah, I'm trying to think over the years with both on my own and with tour groups when I've eaten in my friend's house, because I have this one genuine friend who lives there. Well, we eat out a lot. But if we eat in, yeah, lovely balsamics, of course, olive oils are a huge deal there. The olive oils, the balsamic
What
vinegars,
about like an antipasto?
and yeah.
Is that just a salad without pasta?
No, the antipasto will also be a I am antipasta. No, mi piace pasta. Yeah. I like that. I am antipasta. But yeah, so you get a lot of those kind of mixed things. You see them in Italian markets as well, which are a lot of pickled things. Pickled foods are very good for you, incidentally. Again, I'm not a nutritionist, but
Salty.
some are salty. So if you get the ones that aren't, so the idea of pickled foods, that's very common in old Jewish food and Ukrainian food, but it's actually what some research has come out recently saying after you've done antibiotics or something, you shouldn't be taking probiotics, in the pill form. You want to have pickled foods that generate the probiotics back in your system. Yeah, sauerkraut, yeah. I eat a lot of pickled things when I travel, and as you know, I travel a lot, and I find that it helps keep I very rarely get food poisoning and stuff, and I do eat most things. Like I'm happy to try things. So yeah, Italy, and again, teach their own. So for some people, absolutely Italian food, and it's either the south where you're going or up in Tuscany. Those are the places people really love it. I had a great meal way up in Turin one time, which is all local, but it was cured meats things, but it was just delicious. I mean, just fantastic. But then
It tastes good, it's
Mhm.
just that I'm trying to
try to avoid, yeah, exactly, and you should try to avoid it. And then I always drink sparkling water. Americans don't seem to like it. Yeah, the water's safe to drink.
It is.
Yeah, I drink the water out of the tap everywhere. I'm really trying, and you probably feel the same. I'm really trying not to have bottled water. I live in a national park. Like I think it's bottled water industry is not a water industry; it's a plastic industry. And all the research coming out about the microplastics that we take in from them, but not just that. It's just water. I mean, we don't need plastic. Drinking water is a human right. But if I sit down for lunch in Italy, I will almost guarantee you have a glass of wine. You tend to pay for it. They sometimes will give you tap water, but otherwise I will get a bottle of water and a nice glass bottle. So then and then personally, I like sparkling water. So I feel like I'm getting a value added in sparkling water. I like the champagne of waters. But yeah, so you sit down, but try and watch in a small town. Do we have to go on these? Okay, but when you oh yeah, but you sit down in the sort of traditional watch. I mean, I remember my dad, like I told you yesterday, Dad went to 130 countries when he retired, but he would go into Italy and some of these small towns that loved food. And he's like, okay, I have 60 euros, please just bring me whatever you think I should have.